much for having me. I'm so honored to be here. I'd like to thank all of you for giving me an opportunity to add value to what you do. I am, as you said, first and foremost, a bereaved father, and I share the thoughts and prayers of all of you who've gone through this fire that we're all going through now. And there is a transition and a transcending to this. And some of us are just a little farther down the path, and some of us might be farther down the path, but we still need a hand to hold on to. So don't think that any of us are so far gone that we can't turn around and say, help me, please. So with that said, I think we're kind of here really to talk about returning to work after a loss, because unfortunately, in this day and age, unless you're independently wealthy, we do have to return to our workplace. And so many of us are involved in that. It's just part of life and part of what we've got to get back to. And as was alluded to just a moment ago, it might not just be the workplace that we're returning to. It might be a social environment that we're going back to. Any of these areas are something that we need to realize that we're definitely going to face some challenges when we do, first and foremost. So I'd like to kind of put a little anecdote up here that I kind of, I went through when I lost John, and it really opens up my thoughts when we talk about going back to the workplace after a loss. But I was the number two in a fairly large regional company when I lost John. And before the loss, it had become a habit where I was working for each of my managers. I had 9 managers that worked with me inside of the office. And when I first got there, they started to come by my door every morning with a cup of coffee in hand just to say hello. And over the few years before John passed away, they turned into a little more in-depth, but still impromptu meetings where we would sit and we would talk and we'd discuss what was going on for the day to come. And we got to know each other. It was a wonderful way to build camaraderie with my staff. And, it might not have been everybody's business model, but it started working well for me. I knew that every day I was going to get an eye on what was going on, and I could change things if I need to, or make suggestions, or just sit back and say, well, I think the day is going to be okay. And then John passed, and I took my time off from work. And when I returned to work after my bereavement leave, nobody came by my door anymore. Nobody stopped by. And on a personal level, it was devastating. And on a work level, it was devastating. And I realized then that my impact from that rippled across the entire organization from just my loss alone out of 1,300 employees. So after I kind of got myself together, let me tell you the story about John real quick, though. John was somebody who was born in 1997 with a condition called hypoplastic left heart syndrome. He really wasn't supposed to make it to his first day of life. Through God's will and a great surgeon, we came up with an experimental surgery that gave him a prognosis for a full life. He wasn't supposed to pass away. But long story short, at 16 years of age, during a routine, and there are no routine medical procedures out there, but during a routine medical procedure, his heart crashed and they weren't able to revive him. I took a lot of issues with that, but I will tell you this, through my transition through grief, I went back to sit on the board of that very children's hospital where my son lost his life. And it was able to allow me to move forward in ways that I never imagined possible. Because what I had done was, a year after he had passed away, I wrote a book called Sometimes I Cry in the Shower. And I'm not trying to pimp the book. I'm just trying to let you know that brought me into a world where somebody invited me to speak, and then somebody invited me to do workshops. And before I knew it, I was giving back to people that I knew that could help me, and I could help them at the same time. And then I received an invitation from the headquarters of Delta Airlines in Atlanta, Georgia, to come down and speak before really a gathering of all their bereaved employees from around the United States that wanted to come in for a day of just being with me as a guest speaker and a workshop presenter for the day. And in preparation for that day, that very, very humbling day, I figured I would look into some of the impacts, not just of my loss and how it impacted me on the job and how it impacted me personally before I went back, but through every businesses, both in, let's just say in all of America, whether it be the US or Canada. And what I found out was truly, truly, truly shocking. It really blew my mind. And before I go any farther, if we want to open this up, if anyone wants to ask questions, the moderator or anything like that, I don't need to just drone on. If you want to ask me questions though, as I'm going along, please feel free to do. If not, I'll just keep going. So, but I had received that invitation to Delta, and some of the things that I found out that I said just really blew my mind. And they're all empirical data, things that I was able to pull out of studies, things I was able to pull out of our government's records and such like that. And what I found out was really over 4 million active American employees will experience a loss of a loved one every year. These are active employees. And according to the American Hospice Foundation, 1 out of every 4 active employees right now in any given workplace is experiencing grief on some level, grief from loss at some level. And the figures just become so overwhelming when we look at the fact that, even per the US CDC, every year, over 1 million women will experience a miscarriage and 26,000 will experience a stillbirth. And yet we don't do enough in our places of employment to really back these employees up. These are the backbone of what we do, and we're really doing nothing. Because you've got to figure 10 to 15% of working age adults, and again, this is all empirical data, will experience the loss of a child each and every year. 10 to 15% of working age adults. Now, 35 is the average age that an employee will lose a child if they do so. 35 is actually the average age of our prime performance on the job. Now, at 59 years of age, that's disappointing for me. I hope you understand that. But 35 is actually the prime average for our performance, if that makes sense to you. The bigger shock is that we will spend in a lifetime an average of 90,000 hours in the workplace. 90,000 hours. We spend more awake time with the people that we work with than we do with our loved ones at home. And it's astounding to think that the influences from our coworkers do not have a major impact on our grief recovery. And the bottom line is we need to go through grief recovery, right? So we go back to work, and what we find out really, and what I found out through my major studies, is there's really 3 different types of workplaces that we can go back to, and agree or disagree during the Q&As with me, but we've got hostile work environments. And when I say hostile, I want you to think back maybe to the 1920s industrial age, where you come to work, you do your job. If you can't do it, somebody else can take your place and they'll do it. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. These places are the exception now and not the norm, thank goodness. But the second level of employer might be the indifferent employer. And the indifferent employer is too far and vast for any comfort level whatsoever. The indifferent employer is one where you go back to work and they try to avoid you. They try to stay out of your way. They try to just make sure that you do your job. They're not really interested in your grief. And we see that quite a bit out there, don't we? I know that I did when I went back to work. And then, of course, the third sample that we've got is the compassionate workplace. And in the compassionate workplace, I'll give you Delta Airlines for one. They actually set up an internal peer-to-peer bereavement support group inside the corporation-wide. And it's sponsored by Delta Airlines, and they're provided with many, many, many benefits that they've got for coming and being a part of that group. Does that make sense? Do I have any questions from the moderator before I go forward? No questions whatsoever?
Not at this point, Ron. No.
Very good, very good. I know this is dry information and it's usually done in a Q&A form, but I hope we can break open their Q&A form because, I take a look at this stuff. And again, before we came into the program, we were talking somewhat about my study of US versus Canadian when it comes to, bereavement leave, FMLA. And I found out that we are very similar in the fact that we are still so screwed up as far as I'm concerned. Okay, now, right now, in the United States, the average amount of bereavement leave that's allowed by an employer, is 4 days for an immediate family member. Now, if you look at policy, it's 3 days. The average number of bereavement days that are given, that's paid or unpaid, it doesn't matter. You're not required to give paid in either country. But the average number of days is 4 days, 3 days by policy. And basically, it's 4 days or 5 days for any non-immediate family member, such as a grandparent or something like that. Now, let's look at FMLA. Now, I know down here in the United States, we are trying very hard to get bereavement leave placed under FMLA, and we are failing at every attempt, but we're not going to stop trying. There are people I know that are still lobbying our government entities up on Capitol Hill trying to get this pushed through. But the reason why I bring up FMLA is because right now, and I don't want you to gasp at this, but I mean, when we look at the maternity aspect of FMLA, a woman can give birth to a child and deservedly so take as much time as she needs up to a certain level and be protected to return to her job. But should that woman sadly, and let's hope it doesn't happen, but sadly experience a loss of that child, she can only have 3 days to deal with it. 3 days to deal with the loss of a child. Now, that to me in itself doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It truly doesn't. But we go back to the different companies that we've got out there, the ones that aren't hostile towards our grief. And I think if we think about it hard enough, all of us can come up with examples of maybe what a hostile employee would be like. But even the indifferent companies out there, what happens with these is mortality is a sensitive topic. Nobody likes to think about mortality. So what they do is they outsource your mortality, and they outsource this to, let's say, EAP programs. Everybody's familiar with the employee assistance programs, correct? Now, the issue with that, and God love the employee assistance programs, they're fantastic, and to be able to go out and get support is amazing. But you know that a study was done by SHRM, the Society of Human Resource Management, that only 3 to 7% of eligible employees will ever take advantage of an employee assistance program. So that in itself tells us that, hey, look, if I have a child that passes and I go back to work and you offer me an EAP program and you turn around and you say that I've done everything that I can do for you, you've done far less than you can do for me. You've got to realize that I get more influence by people that I work with every day than I will ever get from going to see a counselor, a clergy, or someone like that on a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly basis. I show up for work every day, right?
Ron,
So, yes, ma'am.
we have a question, just wondering about what it was like around the time John died for you going back to work. You gave us that lovely, very clear anecdote about how the coffee meeting changed overnight. But what was that transition back like for you, and how much time did you take off?
Well, I took probably, and it's a good question. We'll talk about this, and hopefully questions like this come up in the Q&A, because I went back to work rather quickly. I went back to work because I tried to delay or defer my grief. I thought going back to work, I could control things. I needed to control things. I had lost control. The loss of Jonathan was out of my control, and I just needed to control something. So I went back and basically was taking myself down the road of complicated grief just by delaying, deferring, or just trying to ignore my grief altogether. Others can return quickly to work and use it as a good tool, if you will, in their grief work. Right. By allowing themselves to shut down the grief for a little while, go concentrate on work, but please, 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 once you're done with work and you go back, make sure you open that grief bag again and get back into it. Does that make sense?
For sure.
Yeah, so I went back rather quickly. But you know, we were talking about businesses that really don't get it right now. And here's an astounding figure. And this is all of North America, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Across America right now, this year, businesses will collectively lose over $100 billion in annual revenue, $100 billion with a B in annual revenue, all from grief in the workplace. And the sad part is it doesn't cost them a dime to mitigate that astonishing figure. All they need is just a change in, yes, the cliche term that we said is cliche during the pre-show, just change their paradigm, change the way that they think about things. It doesn't cost you a dime, right? So I think what we've got to look at is, you know, we're going back to work. We've talked about the workplace. We've talked about being indifferent. We've talked about the compassionate ones and the hostile ones. But let's talk about us when we go back, because that was a lead up to your question there is what about us, right? And the first thing we need to realize is, like any other question, we need to take care of ourselves first. And that's of utmost important. The vast majority of us are, and I said this earlier, it's hard to say that anything is normal in our grief, but if we look at the studies, we can call ourselves either normal or complicated grievers. And the vast majority of us are normal grievers. We're going to go through a process in our grief where we're going to start out in acute grief, and we're going to transition into a more abiding kind of grief where we're beginning to be able to function again. The biggest thing is that when we're in that acute grief stage, transitioning to an ability to accept the loss, we're generally going to do that at home. Does that make sense? It's before we go back after bereavement leave, and timing is different. There are no linear timelines to this, no chronological order where you have to go from the acute to the abiding stage. But when it happens, it's generally at home around the comfort of loved ones. And now you're considering going back to work. You feel good, you feel like you can handle it. But once you go back into the workplace, you've got to realize that you're re-entering another world again. You're re-entering a place where at one time it might have been your second home. There might have been relations there, and still are. There are relationships there that are close relationships with peers, subordinates, supervisors that may not carry out beyond the workplace, but they care about you and you care about them. Yet they're going to be faced with your mortality, and they are not trained to deal with your mortality, nor are you trained to deal with them. So one of the biggest things that we have to do when we go back to the workplace is we have to realize that we're going back through a whole new kind of environment, an unexplored territory yet. So we have to make sure that we're well prepared for that. See, there was a term, maybe people have heard this term before, but there was a psychiatrist named Dr. Lindman. In 1944, he said the term grief work, and the term grief work even sticks today. I mean, grief work is something that we've all got to go through. Grief work involves the many different tasks and many different processes that we all have to experience as we're going through this grief process that we're going through, all this tough stuff. And a lot of times you can tell that it's no less strenuous, both physically and mentally, than either digging a ditch or trying to solve an almost unsolvable riddle. But we've got to go through the grief work. And when we return to work, we're returning to an environment that might not be as loving and sort of that safe harbor as it was at home. I will tell you this, when I talk to business leaders and we talk about some of the loss that happens that they could actually control, one of the topics I bring up is absenteeism. Now, in America, in the United States, I can tell you that Department of Labor has determined that every year, unscheduled absenteeism on the job costs U.S. businesses over $400 billion every year. Well, they don't also realize that a newly bereaved employee will also experience an additional 30 days of unscheduled absence in the first year following their loss. Do you know why that is? Do you know why there's 30 days of unscheduled absence? Because the workplace is not a safe environment. As we all know, we all go through waves of grief. When we wake up in the morning and if we've gotten a good night's sleep and we're hit by a wave of grief, we want someplace where we can shelter in a safe harbor. And if we know that workplace is not that safe harbor that it once was, then we're going to shelter at home. Does that make sense? So before I open up to Q&As, and I'd like to open it up to Q&As, let's make sure that we realize that when we return to work, we have to take care of ourselves. And I do hope that we can get some questions on just how we can do that. I think it would be much better to do that than sit here and just try to put everything in a dry format speaking with you. So thank you for your time. And if we can, if allowed, let's open it up to some questions.